Before the Civil War, two different groups, both called the State Agricultural Society, tried operating state fairs, but failed for several reasons, including the lack of railroads. After the war, a new state fair tradition began and continues today, celebrating its 150th fair, only skipping 1 year in 1918 due to an influenza epidemic.
The fair, when it began in 1869, used the experiences from the two previous groups that had had pre-war fairs and realized that they needed to bring not just agriculture. So rather than it just being an agricultural fair, the name of the organization is Agricultural and Mechanical Society. So they really began to look at promoting the industries of the state as well. And in doing that, they also realized they needed to provide entertainment.
At its inception, the State Fair was located off of Elmwood Avenue. At the turn of the 20th century, the fair had outgrown the Elmwood location, and in 1904 it moved to the Rosewood Fairgrounds with plenty of room to expand.
Beginning in the early 1900s, the carnival activities were a carnival operator that the fair would just book with. They would bring the rides and some of the side shows, the freak shows, the girly shows, those kinds of things. The grandstand was a huge event which had activities at night generally, starting with performances, and there's some images of people like Gene Autry performing at the grandstand. Musical groups constantly were doing that. And there was a great photograph of President Taft in a wonderful vintage car. The horse racing has been a part of the fair since the very beginning. It lasted until about the 1920s and 30s, and it began to go away. People weren't as interested in racing horses as they were cars. The car racing turned into stunt shows, so those were always part of the fair. The fair reflects what's going on in South Carolina, both socially and culturally. The Colored State Fair started because the African Americans were not being treated properly, and so they started their own fair. And so when you reach the period of civil rights, I think it plays itself out in the fair. If you look at the organization that ran the Colored State Fair, its initial name was the Colored State Fair Association. In the early 1950s, the term colored was no longer acceptable, so they changed the name of it to the Palmetto State Fair.
Through his research on the social and cultural impacts of the fair, Dr. Stroup found a few interesting surprises.
Beginning in the 1870s, there was a state ball which was held principally in the State House chambers of the House of Representatives on the Thursday night of State Fair Week. So the state ball became a debutante ball by the late 1890s. It was the social event of the year in the state. It continued through 1917.
This ball, along with special horse racing and premiums being handed out, led to the moniker BigThursday. However, a lot of people associate this term with a very different event.
Beginning in the 1890s, Carolina and Clemson began playing football on the fairgrounds. They played every year from 1909 through 1959, and it was called Big Thursday.
From historic events to iconic sights, no one who goes to the fair can miss the rocket.
Well, the rocket actually came to the city of Columbia in the early 1960s, and then in the late 1960s they decided to put it up. It was an intercontinental ballistic missile, which was decommissioned by the Air Force, and it's right by the Rosewood Drive entrance, so it's very visible. So when the PA system was put into the fairgrounds and people would end up getting lost, they would always ask for you to meet your mother at the rocket. So it became a gathering place. So when Mom and Dad would take the kids and they'd say, well, we'll meet you in 2 hours, generally what people would say, well, we'll meet you at the rocket.
The fair attracts people for many reasons, but it still holds on to its roots.
I think from the standpoint of the agriculture, it's very important because it's the one place where we still have judged entries of various types. I think the one thing that's changed drastically, though, is there are many, many more entries in the fair and many, many more categories now than there were 100 years ago.
The sights and sounds may change a little each year, but Dr. Stroup found a common theme.
I think the main thing the State Fair means to South Carolinians is it's an opportunity to get together and celebrate the history of the state, as well as the agricultural and industrial facilities which we have in the state.
And we're off and running, ladies and gentlemen.